In medieval Europe, few roles were more feared or more reviled than that of the executioner tasked with enforcing the harshest sentences of the law. These men wielded authority over life and death, but while they acted under legal command, society treated them as if they themselves were criminals. Nowhere was this contradiction more evident than in their exclusion from religious life. Despite being appointed by the state or sanctioned by royal decree, executioners were often barred from entering churches, participating in Mass, or even receiving sacraments known as Scharfrichter in the German-speaking Holy Roman Empire, or simply as the hangman in England. Their presence was believed to defile sacred spaces in some towns. Priests refused to hear their confessions. Others allowed it, but only from a distance behind screens or outside the church walls. This spiritual exclusion was not only humiliating, it cast a long shadow over their souls. In a deeply Christian society where salvation and community worship were central to identity, the message was clear. Your work may serve man's law, but it violates God's. Theologians debated this paradox. Some, like 13th century Dominican thinkers, argued executioners served divine justice, yet others saw them as spiritually tainted by the blood they shed. This alienation wasn't just symbolic, it affected every aspect of the executioner's life, beginning at the altar and echoing well beyond. The fact that they were forbidden to participate in church rituals and sacraments was a humiliation that permeated their daily existence as social outcasts who were both necessary yet excluded. They lived lives defined by contradictions. They held power over the condemned, yet were themselves condemned to live in the shadows of society. Executioners were often viewed with a mixture of fear and contempt. They were seen as necessary instruments of justice, but their profession placed them outside the moral community they were expected to uphold. Their role was essential, yet their presence in society was toxic. Many towns and cities placed additional restrictions on them, barring them from entering sacred spaces or even receiving basic human courtesies like confession, which were integral to a Christian's salvation. Some priests treated them with scorn, refusing them spiritual services, while others allowed them only the most humiliating forms of participation. Even within a church, executioners were segregated, treated as spiritually defiled. These actions were not simply about personal feelings, they were institutionalized practices meant to maintain moral purity in a deeply religious society where one's connection to God and the church was paramount. The exclusion of executioners from the religious community reinforced their social isolation and cemented their role as outsiders living in spiritual exile. Lived in homes built outside city boundaries, even when not performing their grim duties, executioners were marked socially, spatially, and permanently. In many medieval towns and cities, they were legally or unofficially required to live beyond the city walls, not because they posed a danger, but because their very presence was believed to bring spiritual and moral pollution. Executioners were often given houses on the outskirts, sometimes near gallows hills or cemeteries. These homes were not offered out of generosity, but out of necessity. No one else wanted to live near them. In cities like Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and Paris, historical records reveal entire hangman's quarters, Henkerhauser, placed far from markets, churches, and community centers. The message was clear: justice must be done, but not seen, and certainly not welcome. This forced separation served multiple functions. It physically removed the executioner from daily town life, reinforcing his outsider status. It also ensured his children would grow up on the margins, far from the institutions and networks that shaped civic identity. These homes were not built to comfort or honor the executioner, but to isolate and separate his family from the rest of society. Children born into such circumstances carried the social burden of their father's profession and were marked by their association with the hangman's role. In a deeply stratified medieval society where status was closely tied to one's position in the community, this forced separation reinforced the idea that the executioner's family was always to be kept at a distance. Their lives were defined by exclusion, isolation, and the shame of their father's work, no matter How hard they tried to escape the past, their social status was inherited and could not be outrun. Forbidden from touching goods in public markets, to live as a medieval executioner was to be surrounded by invisible walls, none more humiliating than those imposed in the very heart of public life, the marketplace. In many towns across Europe, executioners were legally prohibited or socially discouraged from touching goods in open markets with their bare hands. The stigma of their profession was so strong that even the act of selecting produce or bread was seen as contaminating. Local ordinances from cities like Augsburg and Basel reveal explicit restrictions. Executioners could not handle merchandise directly, nor could they engage freely in trade. In some regions, market vendors would only sell to them if they used a stick or glove to point at the desired item, avoiding all contact. Others demanded pre-arranged times for them to shop after the crowds had left. This wasn't a matter of superstition alone. Many townspeople believed that the executioner's touch carried spiritual impurity capable of tainting not just objects, but entire stalls. Such beliefs made daily tasks humiliating and alienating for an executioner. Even simple acts like purchasing food became a source of pain and public scorn. It was an isolation not just physical but psychological. The market, where all goods and services were exchanged, became a place where the executioner was constantly reminded of his place in the social order. He was neither trusted nor welcomed, and even civil. Most basic acts of living were tainted by the belief that his touch was inherently dirty. Denied burial in consecrated ground after death. In medieval Europe, death was not the end of judgment. It was merely the beginning of a soul's journey toward salvation. For the ground after death in medieval Europe, death was not the end of judgment. It was merely the beginning of a soul's journey toward salvation. For the Kidif executioner, however, even in death, exclusion persisted. Many were denied burial in consecrated ground, their bodies laid to rest outside churchyards beyond the reach of sacred rites. This final indignity reflected a life lived on the margins and a spiritual exile that outlasted the grave. Church law in several regions drew a clear line. Those who had spilled blood even in service of the law were considered ritually impure. Local parish records from towns in the Holy Roman Empire and parts of France show numerous instances of executioners being buried near crossroads, gallows fields, or in plots specifically reserved for the dishonored. No priest would officiate, no church bell would toll. This practice wasn't simply bureaucratic. It stemmed from a deeply rooted belief that the executioner, though legally employed, had spiritually defiled himself through repeated contact with death. Canon law rarely offered clear guidance on the issue, leaving individual parishes to decide. Some more compassionate clergy quietly blessed graves from a distance. Others refused entirely, as the medieval worldview placed immense weight on burial location and sacred rituals. This exclusion was devastating in a society where eternity hinged on ritual. Being cast outside holy ground meant more than dishonor. It threatened the soul's very faith. The executioner could not escape the cycle of exclusion, not in life and not in death. Their entire existence was bound by the chains of spiritual isolation and public rejection. Their children inherited the same social shame. The legacy of a medieval executioner did not end with his death. It extended cruelly to his children in many parts of Europe. The social stigma attached to the executioner's role was hereditary. Sons and daughters, though innocent of any crime or participation in punishment, often inherited the same isolation, mistrust, and restrictions that shaped their parents' life. This transmission of dishonor was both legal and cultural. In some regions, the profession was passed down from father to son, not by choice, but because few other occupations were open to them. Guilds, which controlled most skilled trades in medieval towns, routinely rejected the children of executioners. They were excluded from apprenticeships, barred from holding office, and often denied marriage into respectable families. In a world defined by birth duty and divine order, a family could be cast into permanent social exile, all because one of their own had carried out the will of the law. The children of executioners were often marked as unworthy of acceptance into society, no matter How hard they tried to break free from their family's past, their place in society was fixed by the role their fathers had played. Their lives were marked by the shame of a parent's profession from childhood. Through adulthood, they carried the weight of their father's work as their own, and their future was dictated by the same stain that branded their fathers. So they were children of a condemned profession, born into a world that would never fully accept them, no matter their innocence. To live as a medieval executioner was to exist in a constant state of contradiction, indispensable, yet rejected. Empowered yet exiled, their lives reveal the deep tension between justice and morality, where those who enforced order were themselves denied inclusion in the very society they protected. In a world ruled by divine law and rigid social hierarchies, punishment did not end with the condemned, it extended in silence and shame to the hand that carried it out. Executioners were necessary for maintaining order in a lawless world, but their own lives were a testament to the brutal consequences of living outside the community they helped to build. The executioner's existence was defined not by the respect their work commanded, but by the rejection it earned them from the very society they were sworn to protect. The executioner's role as a figure of both power and scorn illustrates the complexity of medieval justice and the harsh realities of social exclusion, despite their essential function in upholding the law. Executioners were treated as pariahs. Their actions were seen as necessary, but their presence was always unwelcome. The contradiction between their duty to enforce justice and their exclusion from the moral and spiritual community highlights the difficult moral questions medieval society faced. If a person could serve the law, yet be deemed unworthy of salvation, could the system they upheld ever be truly just, or were they simply a necessary evil in a world that had yet to fully reconcile law and mercy? This tension continued for generations as the executioner's family inherited the same shame passed down through the centuries like a curse that could not be undone for the executioner and their children. The cycle of rejection never truly ended. It was a life lived on the periphery, always looking in but never truly being a part of the world they helped shape. Does a society that punishes its punishers reflect justice or fear? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. As Cesare Beccaria wrote in On Crimes and Punishments, it is not the intensity of punishment that has the greatest effect on the human spirit, but its permanence, the permanence of the executioner's shame. Their eternal exclusion from the community they served reflects the harsh and unforgiving nature of medieval justice. A justice that saw no redemption for the one who carried out its orders, a justice that ultimately left both the condemned and the executioner trapped in their own cycles of punishment, one never escaping without the other. This unrelenting cycle of duty and shame continues to raise questions about the true nature of justice and the lasting effects of punishment on the human soul.